Picture this. It's October 17th, 1781, and you're a British soldier standing in the wreckage of what was once the most powerful army in North America. Your red coat is covered in mud and gunpowder residue. You haven't slept in 3 days. The sound of American and French artillery has been so constant that your ears are ringing even now, in this brief moment of silence. You look around at your fellow soldiers. These men conquered half the world. They broke the French at Quebec. They crushed colonial rebellions from Boston to Charleston. But now they're starving, exhausted, and trapped in a collapsing hell called Yorktown. Then you hear it, the order you never thought would come. The order that will echo through history and shake the foundations of the British Empire. Lay down your arms. You're about to witness the birth of a nation and the death of an empire. And it's happening because your generals made one catastrophic mistake after another until there was nowhere left to run. This isn't just a defeat. This is the moment when 13 ragtag colonies humiliated the greatest military power on Earth and changed the world forever. By the end of this story, you'll understand how George Washington orchestrated the most brilliant deception in American military history, how the French fleet turned the Chesapeake Bay into a prison, and how 8,000 British soldiers, the cream of His Majesty's forces, were ground down day by day, hour by hour, until they had no choice but to surrender. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The British could have won. Even at Yorktown, even surrounded, they had options. The decisions made in those final weeks were so catastrophically bad that they destroyed not just an army, but an entire strategy for winning the war. The road to Yorktown began not with a battle, but with a miscalculation that would doom the British cause in America. To understand why 8,000 veteran soldiers ended up trapped in a death trap on the Virginia coast, you have to go back to the strategic disaster unfolding in the South. By 1780, the British had already lost the North. Saratoga had been a humiliation. The French had entered the war, and George Washington's Continental Army, despite years of defeats and near starvation, refused to die. So British strategists in London looked at their maps and convinced themselves they'd found the answer: the South. The logic seemed sound on paper. The southern colonies were filled with loyalists, or so the British believed. The plantations produced tobacco and rice, valuable exports that Britain desperately needed. And the enslaved population, nearly 40% of the South's people, would supposedly keep the white colonists loyal to the crown out of fear of rebellion. It was a fantasy built on wishful thinking and outdated intelligence. The man chosen to execute this southern strategy was Lord Charles Cornwallis. He was 52 years old, a veteran of European wars, and a competent general by the standards of his day. But Cornwallis had a fatal flaw. He believed that aggressive action could solve any problem. He thought the way to crush the rebellion was to keep moving, keep attacking, and force the rebels into decisive battles where British discipline and training would prevail. What he didn't understand was that he was fighting a different kind of war against a different kind of enemy. Cornwallis began his campaign with impressive victories. He smashed the American army at Camden in August 1780. It was a complete rout. The American general, Horatio Gates, the supposed hero of Saratoga, fled so fast that he covered 60 miles in a single day, abandoning his army to be slaughtered. Cornwallis looked at the wreckage and saw confirmation of his strategy. Hit them hard, hit them fast, break their will to fight. But then something strange happened. He won the battles, but he kept losing the war. Every time he advanced, American militia would swarm around his supply lines. They'd ambush his foraging parties. They'd burn bridges and destroy food stores. And every time he tried to consolidate his gains, the rebels would slip away into the swamps and forests, only to reappear behind him. It was guerrilla warfare, and the British had no answer for it. The turning point came at a place called Cowpens in January 1781. An American general named Daniel Morgan, a rough frontier fighter who'd learned warfare fighting Indians, laid a trap so perfect it's still studied in military academies today. Morgan knew the British would charge. They always charged. So he positioned his militia in front, told them to fire 2 volleys and then run. When the British saw the Americans fleeing, they broke formation and chased them, thinking they'd won. That's when Morgan's Continentals, hidden behind a ridge, stood up and fired a devastating volley into the British flank. Then his cavalry swept in from behind. The British force was annihilated. 900 men killed or captured in less than an hour. Cornwallis, when he heard the news, went into a rage. He ordered his entire army to burn their supply wagons so they could move faster. He was going to chase down Morgan and destroy him, even if it meant starving his own men to do it. This decision, burning those wagons, was the first domino to fall in the chain that would lead to Yorktown. By stripping himself of supplies, Cornwallis made himself dependent on the Royal Navy to keep him fed and armed. He had just put a noose around his own neck. He just didn't know it yet. For the next 8 months, Cornwallis chased American armies across North and South Carolina. He won most of the battles. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, he drove the Americans from the field. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. He lost a quarter of his army doing it. As one British politician later said, another such victory would ruin the British army. Cornwallis was bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts, and the Americans just kept giving him more opportunities to win himself into destruction. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. He couldn't hold the Carolinas. The rebels were too numerous and too slippery. So he marched north into Virginia, telling himself that if he could conquer Virginia, the rest of the South would collapse. It was the same flawed logic that had guided British strategy throughout the war. Just one more victory, just one more conquest. Then the rebels will give up. He entered Virginia with about 7,000 men. He joined forces with British troops already there, under Benedict Arnold, the American traitor who'd switched sides after his plot to sell West Point to the British was discovered. Together they began raiding through Virginia, burning tobacco warehouses and disrupting American supply lines. It was destructive, but it wasn't winning the war. Cornwallis was just creating more enemies. Then came the order that sealed his fate. General Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief in New York, told Cornwallis to establish a naval base on the Virginia coast. Clinton wanted a fortified port where the Royal Navy could operate, protect loyalists, and serve as a springboard for future operations. It seemed like a reasonable order. It was actually a death sentence. Cornwallis surveyed the coast and chose a small tobacco port called Yorktown on the York River. It had a decent harbor. It had high ground for fortifications. And it was close enough to the Chesapeake Bay that the Navy could easily reach it. He moved his entire army there in August 1781 and began digging in. What Cornwallis didn't know was that hundreds of miles to the north, George Washington and a French general named Rochambeau were looking at maps and seeing an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. Cornwallis had put himself on a peninsula with water on 3 sides. If the French Navy could control the Chesapeake Bay, even for a few weeks, Cornwallis would be trapped. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel. All they had to do was get their armies to Virginia before the British figured out what was happening. The pieces were falling into place for the greatest strategic masterstroke of the Revolutionary War. But George Washington had a problem. He couldn't just march south to Virginia. If General Clinton in New York realized Washington's army was leaving, Clinton would either reinforce Cornwallis or attack Philadelphia. Washington needed Clinton to believe that the Franco-American army was preparing to attack New York. He needed to deceive the British so completely that they wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. What followed was a deception campaign so brilliant that intelligence agencies still study it today. And it worked so perfectly that by the time the British understood what was happening, it was already over. George Washington spent the summer of 1781 playing a deadly game of poker with the British, and he was holding all the cards. The stage was set in the New York area, where Washington's Continental Army and Rochambeau's French Expeditionary Force were camped north of New York City, watching General Clinton's garrison. Clinton had about 17,000 men in New York, making it the strongest British position in America. Washington had about 9,000 troops, and Rochambeau had arrived with another 5,000 French regulars. On paper, it looked like a stalemate. But Washington knew something Clinton didn't. A massive French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean with 3,000 additional French troops and 28 ships of the line. If that fleet could control the Chesapeake Bay and Washington could get his army to Virginia, they could trap Cornwallis completely. The trick was getting there without Clinton figuring out what was happening. Washington began his deception in late July. He ordered his engineers to build large military ovens near New York, the kind used to bake bread for armies preparing for a long siege. He had his men construct fascines and gabions, bundles of wood used in siege warfare. He spread rumors through New York's network of spies and loyalist sympathizers that the Franco-American forces were preparing a major assault on New York. He even had his soldiers conduct reconnaissance missions in broad daylight, surveying British fortifications as if planning attack routes. Clinton bought it completely. He sent urgent dispatches to London, warning that New York was about to be besieged. He called for reinforcements. He canceled plans to send troops to Cornwallis in Virginia because he needed every man to defend New York. Washington's fake preparations had frozen Clinton in place exactly as intended. On August 14, 1781, Washington received the news he'd been praying for. De Grasse's fleet had left the Caribbean and was sailing for the Chesapeake. The window was open, but it was a narrow one. The French fleet could only stay on the American coast until mid-October before hurricane season forced them back to the Caribbean. Washington had maybe 8 weeks to march his army 350 miles south, link up with the French fleet, and destroy Cornwallis. It was one of the most audacious plans in military history. On August 19th, the Franco-American army began to move, but they didn't march south. Not yet. Washington continued the deception. He marched his troops north and east toward Staten Island, as if preparing to cross and attack. He had his men build a camp in New Jersey with enough tents for 40,000 men, far more than he actually commanded. He started constructing a bridge of boats across the Hudson River in full view of British observers. Every signal screamed that the attack on New York was imminent. Then, on August 26th, Washington made his move. Under cover of darkness, the entire Franco-American army pivoted south. They marched through New Jersey at a brutal pace, covering 15 to 20 miles a day in the late summer heat. The soldiers didn't know where they were going. Most assumed they were heading to Philadelphia. Only Washington, Rochambeau, and a handful of senior officers knew the truth. Clinton didn't realize what had happened for almost a week. By the time British scouts confirmed that Washington's army had crossed into Pennsylvania, it was too late to stop them. Clinton sent frantic messages to Cornwallis, warning him that he might be the target, but Cornwallis didn't take the threat seriously. He was busy building fortifications at Yorktown and running raids through Virginia. He figured if Washington came south, the Royal Navy would evacuate him before he could be trapped. Washington's army reached Philadelphia on September 2nd. The soldiers finally learned they were heading to Virginia. Many of them hadn't been paid in months. Some were barefoot. Others had uniforms so ragged they barely qualified as clothing. But when the residents of Philadelphia turned out to cheer them, when they saw the French soldiers in their gleaming white uniforms marching alongside them, something changed in their step. They were no longer a beaten, half-starved mob. They were an army marching to end the war. The race was now a matter of timing. Washington needed 3 things to happen simultaneously. His army had to reach Virginia, the French fleet had to arrive in the Chesapeake and control the bay, and Cornwallis had to stay put in Yorktown long enough to be trapped. If any one of those pieces failed, the whole plan collapsed. On September 5th, 1781, the first piece fell into place. De Grasse's French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 additional troops. The French immediately sent ships up the James River to cut off any possibility of Cornwallis escaping by water to the south. They positioned frigates at the mouth of the York River to bottle up the harbor at Yorktown. The naval noose was tightening. But then came a crisis that nearly undid everything. A British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived from New York with 19 ships of the line. Graves had finally figured out what was happening and was racing to rescue Cornwallis. If the British fleet could defeat de Grasse and control the Chesapeake, they could evacuate Cornwallis, and the entire plan would fail. What followed was one of the strangest naval battles in history. On September 5th, the 2 fleets met just outside the Chesapeake Bay in what became known as the Battle of the Capes. For 2 hours, the ships hammered each other with broadsides. The British had fewer ships, but they were fighting to save an army. The French had more ships and better position, but they couldn't afford to take heavy damage. The battle ended inconclusively with both fleets damaged but still operational. Here's where the genius of French Admiral de Grasse showed itself. Instead of pursuing the British for a decisive battle, he spent the next 5 days slowly maneuvering to keep his fleet between the British and the Chesapeake. He was playing for time. As long as he kept Graves away from Cornwallis, Washington's trap would work. On September 10th, the British fleet, running low on supplies and unable to break past the French, turned north and sailed back to New York. The door had slammed shut. Cornwallis was now trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula, with no hope of naval evacuation. Washington's army reached Virginia in mid-September. They linked up with the French troops from de Grasse's fleet and additional American forces under the Marquis de Lafayette, who'd been shadowing Cornwallis for months. When Washington counted his troops, he realized he had assembled the largest army of the entire Revolutionary War. 17,000 men, nearly half of them French regulars, were converging on Yorktown. Cornwallis had about 8,000 soldiers trapped inside his fortifications. The siege was about to begin, but Cornwallis still believed he could be rescued. He had faith in the Royal Navy. He had faith in General Clinton. He kept telling his officers that relief was coming. He just needed to hold out for a few weeks. What he didn't know was that Clinton, sitting in New York, was paralyzed by indecision and conflicting intelligence. By the time Clinton finally assembled a rescue fleet, it would be far too late. The trap was set, the prey was cornered, and now Washington was going to show the world that the Continental Army had learned how to fight a European-style siege warfare. The farmers and shopkeepers who'd been mocked as undisciplined rabble were about to destroy the British Army, using the same tactics the British had perfected conquering half the world. The siege of Yorktown began not with a bang, but with the methodical work of men with shovels. On September 28, 1781, the combined Franco-American army completed its encirclement of Cornwallis's position. The British held Yorktown itself in Gloucester Point across the York River. They had built a network of redoubts, small fortifications, in a ring around both positions. It looked impressive. It wasn't. Cornwallis had made a critical error. His outer defenses were too far from the town to be properly supported, but too close to give him real maneuver room. He'd built a prison for himself. Washington spent the first 2 days studying the British position through his telescope. He was looking for weaknesses, and he found them. 2 British redoubts on the southeastern side of the line were isolated from the main fortifications. If he could take those redoubts, he could move his siege artillery close enough to pound Yorktown into rubble. But first, he needed to get his guns into position, and that meant digging. The art of siege warfare in the 18th century was all about geometry and patience. You couldn't just rush fortifications. That was suicide. Instead, you dug parallel trenches, called parallels, running parallel to the enemy's defenses. From these trenches, you would dig approach trenches called saps that zigzagged toward the enemy, making it impossible for defenders to fire down the length of the trench. Then you dig another parallel closer in. Each parallel brought your artillery closer until you could batter down the walls. It was slow, methodical, and brutal. On the night of October 6th, thousands of American and French soldiers moved into position with shovels, picks, and fascines. The work began in complete silence. The men had been ordered not to speak. They moved like ghosts in the darkness, digging frantically before sunrise would expose them. Washington himself turned the first spadeful of earth. It was symbolic. The commander-in-chief was literally digging in the dirt alongside his men. By sunrise on October 7th, the Americans and French had constructed the first parallel. It was a trench system stretching for nearly 2 miles, positioned about 600 yards from the British lines. The British woke up to find an enormous earthwork that hadn't existed the night before. Cornwallis was stunned. He ordered his artillery to fire on the new trenches, but the Americans and French had built their parapets high enough that the British shot mostly sailed overhead, or buried itself harmlessly in the dirt walls. Now came the guns. Over the next 3 days, American and French artillerists dragged dozens of heavy siege cannons into position along the first parallel. They had 24-pounders, 18-pounders, mortars, and howitzers. These weren't the light field pieces that had followed Washington's army through years of retreating. These were ship-killing monsters, and they were about to turn their attention to killing a British army. On October 9th, the bombardment began. Washington again provided the symbolism, personally firing one of the first shots. The sound was apocalyptic. Dozens of cannons opened up simultaneously, the noise rolling across the Virginia countryside like continuous thunder. The French artillerists, trained in the finest military schools in Europe, demonstrated why they were considered the best gunners in the world. Their fire was accurate and devastating. They didn't waste ammunition on random bombardment. They aimed at specific targets: British artillery positions, the town's defenses, ammunition stores, and the ships in the harbor. Inside Yorktown, the British troops were living through hell. The American and French guns fired day and night without pause. Every few seconds, another iron ball would crash into the town. Buildings collapsed. Soldiers were torn apart by flying splinters and shrapnel. The British couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat a meal without artillery fire interrupting. The constant noise and vibration drove some men mad. A young British officer wrote in his journal, "The enemy's fire is terrible. Scarcely a minute passes without the crash of shots striking the houses. We are all exhausted, covered in dirt, and terrified." Another noted that the town is laid waste. Hardly a house is left standing. The dead lie unburied in the streets because it's too dangerous to go out and bury them. The British tried to fire back, but their ammunition was running low and their guns were being destroyed faster than they could replace them. French counter-battery fire systematically eliminated British cannons one by one. Within 3 days, the British had lost more than half their artillery. Cornwallis sent increasingly desperate messages to General Clinton in New York. The enemy's artillery fire has been incessant. Our works are nearly demolished. We cannot hold out much longer. For God's sake, send relief. But Washington wasn't satisfied with just pounding the town from 600 yards. He wanted to get closer. On the night of October 11th, another massive digging operation began. This time, the soldiers dug the second parallel, positioning it just 300 yards from the British lines. It was dangerous work. British sentries could hear the sound of shovels in the earth. They fired blindly into the darkness, and some of the diggers were hit. But by morning, the second parallel was complete. This is where those two isolated British redoubts became critical. They were still standing, bristling with British soldiers and cannon, and they had clear fields of fire into the new American positions. Washington couldn't bring his artillery forward until those redoubts were neutralized. They had to be taken by storm. It would be the only major assault of the entire siege, and Washington chose his men carefully. Redoubt number 9 would be assaulted by French troops under Baron de Viomenil. Redoubt number 10 would be taken by American light infantry under the command of Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide-de-camp, who'd been begging for a field command for years. This was his chance to prove himself in combat, and he wasn't going to waste it. The assault was scheduled for October 14th at 8 o'clock at night. The men were told to remove the flints from their muskets. This would be done with bayonets only. Firing would alert the entire British army. Speed and silence were everything. As darkness fell, 400 American light infantrymen crept toward Redoubt number 10. They crawled through the darkness, hearts pounding, trying not to make a sound. The British sentries had no idea they were coming. At exactly 8 o'clock, the signal was given. The Americans rose up and charged. Hamilton was at the front, sword drawn, sprinting toward the redoubt. The British sentries saw them and raised the alarm, but it was too late. The Americans were already inside the defensive works. What followed was savage, close-quarters combat in the darkness. Bayonets flashing, men grappling in the dirt. The British fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by numbers and surprise. Within 10 minutes, it was over. Redoubt number 10 belonged to the Americans. Hamilton had led from the front and emerged unscathed. His men had taken the position with minimal casualties. 9 Americans dead, 31 wounded. The British garrison of 70 men was killed or captured. A mile away, the French assault on Redoubt number 9 was equally successful, though bloodier. The French lost 15 dead and 77 wounded, but they took the redoubt. By midnight, American and French engineers were already integrating both captured redoubts into the second parallel. Within 24 hours, additional artillery was moved into position. Now Washington's guns were so close that they were firing at nearly point-blank range. British soldiers described cannonballs skipping through the streets of Yorktown, decapitating men, smashing through buildings. The town was being systematically demolished. Cornwallis knew he was finished. His defenses were collapsing. His men were exhausted and terrified. His ammunition was nearly gone. He made one last desperate attempt to break out. On the night of October 16th, he planned to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester Point, then break through the weaker American lines there and escape north. It was a long shot, but it was better than surrender. The first wave of troops made it across the river in boats. Then a freak storm blew in. The wind whipped the York River into a frenzy. Rain pounded down in sheets. The boats couldn't make the crossing. The soldiers who had already crossed were stranded on the far side with no support. At dawn, Cornwallis had to recall them. His last hope of escape had been literally blown away by an act of God. On the morning of October 17th, Cornwallis faced reality. He had less than a day's worth of ammunition left. His defenses were in ruins. His men were starving. No relief force was coming. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a British drummer boy climbed up onto the parapet and began beating the signal for parley. The sound was almost inaudible over the roar of American and French artillery. A British officer appeared waving a white handkerchief. The guns fell silent. After weeks of continuous bombardment, the sudden quiet was shocking. American and French soldiers stood up in their trenches, straining to see what was happening. The British officer, blindfolded by American troops, was led through the lines to Washington's headquarters. He carried a message from Cornwallis requesting terms for surrender. Washington took his time writing his response. He wasn't going to give the British easy terms. He offered Cornwallis the same conditions the British had given to the American garrison at Charleston the previous year. The troops would be considered prisoners of war, not paroled to fight again. The officers could keep their sidearms. The surrender would happen within 2 days. Cornwallis tried to negotiate better terms, but Washington was done negotiating. These were the terms. Take them, or the bombardment would resume. On October 19, 1781, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the British Army marched out to surrender. The scene was choreographed like a piece of theater. The French army lined one side of the road leading out of Yorktown, resplendent in their white uniforms. The American army lined the other side, more ragged but standing tall. Between them stretched nearly a mile of road, where 8,000 British and German soldiers would walk into captivity. Washington sat on his horse at the head of the American line. Rochambeau sat at the head of the French line. They waited. The British were late, dragging out the humiliation as long as possible. When they finally appeared, they marched with their flags cased, as per the surrender terms. Their regimental colors would not be displayed in defeat. The British military band played a tune. According to legend, it was called "The World Turned Upside Down," though historians debate whether that's accurate. What's not debated is the symbolism. The greatest military power on earth was surrendering to a collection of former colonies it had dismissed as rabble. Lord Cornwallis didn't attend the surrender ceremony. He claimed to be ill, which was probably true. The stress and shame had broken him. He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to hand over his sword. O'Hara tried to give the sword to Rochambeau, as if surrendering to the French was less shameful than surrendering to the Americans. Rochambeau refused and pointed to Washington. O'Hara turned to Washington, but Washington also refused. He wasn't going to accept the sword of a subordinate general. He pointed to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln was the perfect choice. He'd been the American commander at Charleston when the British forced his surrender. Now he was getting his revenge. The British soldiers marched to a field where they were ordered to lay down their weapons. Some threw their muskets down hard, trying to break them so the Americans couldn't use them. French officers had to restore order. One French officer wrote, "The English behaved with great insolence. They showed every mark of scorn and rage, but their rage didn't matter. They were defeated, they were prisoners, and the war for American independence was effectively over." The surrender at Yorktown didn't just destroy a British army. It destroyed British will to continue the war. When news reached London in late November, the government of Lord North collapsed. The king himself reportedly took it like a physical blow, pacing his chambers and repeating, "Oh God, it is all over." The British Parliament voted to begin peace negotiations. The war would drag on for another 2 years in skirmishes and formalities, but Yorktown was the end. The victory was Washington's masterpiece. He had deceived the British completely, marched an army 350 miles, coordinated with a foreign fleet across vast distances with primitive communications, and executed a siege that would have impressed Julius Caesar. The farm boy general who'd lost more battles than he'd won had saved the best for last. He'd proven that Americans could beat the British at their own game using their own tactics. And what of the cost? The Allies lost about 300 men killed and wounded during the siege. The British lost about 500 in combat, but surrendered 8,000 prisoners, including 7,000 fit for duty. It was the largest surrender of British troops in history until Singapore in World War II. Britain also lost dozens of cannons, thousands of muskets, and a fortune in military supplies. More importantly, they lost their credibility. They'd been beaten, and the world had watched it happen. For the Americans, Yorktown was validation. For 7 years, they'd been told they couldn't win. They'd been mocked as undisciplined farmers playing at war. They'd frozen at Valley Forge, starved on the march, died of disease and fed at camps. But they'd never quit. And at Yorktown, they proved that determination could overcome every advantage. The British had better training, better equipment, more money, and the most powerful navy in the world. None of it mattered. The Americans won because they wanted it more, and because they had a leader brilliant enough to seize the moment when it came. The British army that surrendered at Yorktown marched into captivity, but the American army that accepted their surrender marched into legend. They'd done something that seemed impossible. They'd defeated the British Empire. And in doing so, they'd created something new, a nation founded not on monarchy or inheritance, but on the radical idea that people could govern themselves. The road from Yorktown to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 was anticlimactic compared to the siege itself. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but their heart was no longer in the fight. Parliament refused to fund further major operations. General Clinton was recalled to London in disgrace. Peace negotiations began in earnest. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, formally recognized American independence. Britain ceded all territory south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River to the new United States. It was one of the largest territorial transfers in history, creating a nation that would eventually span a continent. None of it would have happened without Yorktown, but victory came with a price that extended beyond the battlefield. The Continental Army that won the war was abandoned by the country it had saved. Congress, broke and ineffective under the Articles of Confederation, couldn't pay the soldiers what they were owed. Men who'd fought for years received promissory notes that were barely worth the paper they were printed on. Some soldiers rioted, others simply went home bitter and disillusioned. Washington himself had to personally intervene to prevent a military coup in 1783, when officers considered marching on Philadelphia to demand their pay. The French allies who made Yorktown possible were treated no better by history. Admiral de Grasse, the man whose fleet trapped Cornwallis, was defeated by the British in the Caribbean a year later and spent the rest of his life defending his reputation. France itself went bankrupt, partly from the cost of supporting American independence, contributing to the financial crisis that sparked the French Revolution. The soldiers in white uniforms who stood at Yorktown would soon be fighting their own revolution, one that would make the American conflict look tame by comparison. For the British, Yorktown was a national trauma. The empire that had defeated the French, conquered India, and dominated global trade had been humiliated by its own colonists. The loss sparked a generation of military reform. The British Army studied what went wrong and vowed never to make the same mistakes again. In a bitter irony, many of the tactical innovations the British developed in response to their American defeat would later be used against Napoleon. Lord Cornwallis survived his defeat and went on to a distinguished career. He became Governor General of India and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, but he never forgot Yorktown. In his later years, he refused to discuss the siege, changing the subject whenever it came up. The memory was too painful. He'd been outgeneraled, outmaneuvered, and humiliated. History would remember him not for his later successes, but for the day he surrendered to the Americans. George Washington returned to Mount Vernon after the war, hoping to retire, but his country wouldn't let him. The government under the Articles of Confederation was failing. The states were fighting each other over trade and borders. The nation was on the verge of collapse. In 1787, Washington came out of retirement to chair the Constitutional Convention. In 1789, he was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. The general who'd won independence now had to figure out how to make the nation work. The veterans of Yorktown scattered across the new nation, carrying their stories with them. Some became farmers, others merchants, a few even became politicians. They were bound together by the knowledge that they'd been present at a moment that changed history. At reunions and Independence Day celebrations, they'd tell their grandchildren about the siege, about the night they stormed the redoubts, about the morning the British surrendered. The stories got better with each telling, but the core truth remained. They'd done something impossible. Today you can visit Yorktown. The earthworks are still there, carefully preserved by the National Park Service. You can walk the ground where the parallels were dug, stand in the redoubts that Hamilton and Viaumenil stormed, look out over the York River where Cornwallis tried to escape. On quiet mornings when the mist rolls in off the river, it's easy to imagine the sound of artillery, the shouts of men, the moment when an empire began to crumble. The surrender field is marked by a simple monument. The inscriptions list the commanders, the dates, the units that fought, but the real monument to Yorktown isn't made of stone. It's the nation that grew from that muddy Virginia field. The United States exists because a group of men refused to accept defeat, because they kept fighting when every rational calculation said they should quit, and because they had leaders brilliant enough to see opportunities and brave enough to seize them. Yorktown teaches us that history's hinges don't announce themselves with fanfare. Washington didn't know, when he fired that ceremonial first shot, that he was firing at the last British army that would ever hold American ground in hostile occupation. Cornwallis didn't know, when he chose Yorktown for his base, that he was choosing the spot where an empire's American ambitions would die. The British soldiers marching into captivity didn't know they were the last major British force to surrender on American soil until World War II. The battle's lessons echo through American military history, At Yorktown, Americans proved they could execute complex combined operations with foreign allies. They demonstrated that determination and clever strategy could overcome material disadvantages. They showed that defensive siegecraft could be just as decisive as dramatic cavalry charges. Every American victory since, from Mexico City to Berlin to Baghdad, has roots in the mud of Yorktown. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about the nature of empire itself. The British Empire in 1781 seemed eternal, invincible, ordained by God to rule the waves and civilize the world. 8,000 of its finest soldiers surrendering to colonial rebels was unthinkable. Yet it happened. Empires fall not because they lose battles, but because they lose the will to keep fighting. Britain could have sent more armies to America. It chose not to because the cost in blood and treasure had become unbearable. The Americans won not by destroying the British military, but by making the price of victory higher than Britain was willing to pay. That's the genius of the American victory at Yorktown. Washington didn't have to conquer Britain. He just had to make it too expensive for Britain to conquer America. The siege was the final proof that the cost had become unacceptable. After Yorktown, British politicians looked at the ledger, calculated the expense of continuing, and decided their empire would survive better by cutting its losses. The world turned upside down at Yorktown, if indeed that was the tune the British band played. The natural order, where powerful empires crushed colonial rebellions, had been inverted. The professional soldiers had surrendered to the citizen soldiers. The global superpower had been beaten by farmers and shopkeepers. The impossible had become real. As the last British soldier stacked his musket on the surrender field and marched into captivity, he was witnessing something unprecedented. He was watching the birth of a new kind of nation, one founded not on conquest or royal blood, but on ideas and sacrifice. The United States that emerged from Yorktown would stumble and struggle. It would nearly tear itself apart in civil war. It would make terrible mistakes and commit grave injustices. But it would endure and grow into a power that would eventually eclipse the British Empire that gave it birth. And it all came down to a tobacco port on the Virginia coast, where 8,000 men laid down their arms and admitted defeat, where a British general sat in his headquarters rather than face the humiliation of surrender, where an American general accepted the sword of his enemy and proved that the colonies he'd fought for could stand as equals to any nation on earth. The bloody end of the British Empire in America didn't come in a single dramatic battle. It came in weeks of grinding siege warfare, in the methodical work of men with shovels, in the mathematics of artillery fire and supply lines. It came when an army ran out of options and a nation ran out of will. Yorktown was the moment when America stopped being an idea and became a reality. The Treaty of Paris made it official, but the war was won in that muddy field in Virginia when the British colors were cased and the American flag flew victorious. Everything that came after, the Constitution, the expansion westward, the wars and triumphs and tragedies of American history, all of it traces back to that October afternoon when the world learned that the American experiment was here to stay. The British soldiers who surrendered at Yorktown went home to an empire that would continue for another century and a half, but it would never again try to reconquer America. The lesson had been learned at too high a cost. The Americans who accepted the surrender went home to a nation that would struggle for years to find its footing, but they'd won something that couldn't be taken away. They'd won the right to govern themselves, to make their own mistakes, to build their own future. And that future began at Yorktown, in the smoke and thunder of a siege that destroyed an army and created a nation.